So I would like to introduce Stephanie and Janet. So Stephanie and Janet are joining us today from Bridging Distance. It is a consulting and training company, and they've been in this business for a long time. And talking about Stephanie, she's the founder and CEO at Bridging Distance. She has been doing a team and leadership development within FMC for a few years now. So she's not new to FMC, which is great. Thank you, Stephanie. And she has a Master's of Science in Organization and Management. And talking about Janet, she's a senior consultant at Bridging Distance. Janet provides deep expertise in workspace culture, employment communication. And Janet will be assisting Stephanie through this session today. So without any further delay, I would like to give it to you, Stephanie. Please
Great.
start.
Okay. Thanks, Ramya. All right, so let me do a new share, and then we will get started. Stop share, and then a new share. Okay. So we're delighted to be here. This is going to be the first part of a series looking at different ways in terms of men and women in communication and different ways in which women can become advocates in work. We don't need to introduce ourselves since Ramya just did that, which is great. Thank you. And in case you can't see us, this is us. Janet has the beautiful sky behind her and all of that. A little bit about Bridging Distance. So we really focus on virtual teams, leadership, and helping people really work well from everywhere, and started in the mid-90s. And so we have a kind of a deep expertise around all the ways in which distance, which includes gender distance and differences, has an impact. So kind of rolling through that, just a little bit about that. In case you haven't used Zoom or this is your first time Zooming, a couple of things around your dashboard will probably look a little bit different than this one because this is for the host, but you can start and stop your video. You can mute if you want to. So there's the button, the mute. You can keep it muted until you're speaking. We are going to be doing breakouts. So hopefully people have not dialed in separately, and then this is going to be interactive. So we're going to ask you to use the chat, which is also on the bottom. You can click on that. It's similar to Teams in terms of the chat. And then you can see you can chat to everyone or you can chat to a particular person. So that's a little bit in terms of the features. Again, this is going to be interactive. And so, so hopefully this will be really a really good value use of your time. So getting started, we're going to do overview. So a brief glimpse in terms of this. And then we're going to go for gender rituals. So we're really going to focus on the ways in which men and women communicate differently. And when I talk about men and women or masculine and feminine, we're talking about not black or white. It's really a continuum. So most of us have a style that's, you know, maybe it's more towards feminine, more towards masculine, but we're somewhere in the middle. That being said, we are also socialized by our gender. So that has a profound impact, not just on our style, but because even if we have a more masculine style, we still are held and socialized through particular norms and stereotypes. So again, just keeping in mind, when I talk about men, women, masculine, feminine, we're talking about the kind of the continuum, and all of us are somewhere in between. This is very intentionally meant to be advocating for women and how we can do it. It's not, we're not trying to place blame on one gender. We're not intending it to be male bashing or anything. It's really about how can we help each other to make the workplace better and to be able to add value. So we're going to do a couple of behaviors, and in the next session, we'll pick up on some other ones and look at some of the unconscious bias. So we're going to talk today about self-advocacy and then interactions, and then have some opportunity to apply that learning. So as we get started then, I wanted to kind of go over some statistics that are really particularly interesting if they're not a little bit even scary. So just looking at that, in 2020, women earned 82 cents compared to the men's dollar. And then doing some research across the globe, actually in India, it's there's a 19% difference between men and women's pay. In Japan, it's actually it's a 17% difference. So different cultures and different countries have it, but it's still kind of in the somewhere between percentage. And what's interesting is that Nordic countries actually have the least pay differential. A couple of other things. Only 38% of companies in the US and it's a little bit higher globally set targets for gender representation. And 12% of companies share a majority of their gender diversity metrics with employees. And then only 37% of companies hold senior leaders accountable for making the progress. And then as that trickles down, it's even less. So those are some pretty important statistics when we look at how to advance women and become a foundation also for what we'll be talking about in the next session. So to that end, I would ask you to, at least to each of you, to chat a question in there, and Janet will kind of monitor that. So for each of you, who are your role models and what do you admire about them? So if you could each take a minute and put into the chat, who are your role models and what do you admire about them?
They may be women, they may be men, all fine. Might be someone from long ago or someone you work with today, might be a mentor.
Yeah. So Janet, who are your role models?
Oh, my mom.
Yeah. Does anybody have, yeah, for me, it's my mom, lots of aunts, all that other stuff. Some males as well, but yeah. So
there's another mom. There's another mother.
Who are your role models and what do you admire about them?
Oh, teachers. That's, teachers. Yeah. What is it about moms and teachers that you admire? Previous boss, self-confident. She emulated self-confidence, believed in me, gave me my self-confidence back. Not afraid to try anything, step outside standard expectations. People who inspire kind of growth. And Chris Hadfield, science, art, the way he approaches issues. Honest, believed in me.
Interesting. Okay. Well, feel free to keep chatting those and we'll keep monitoring that, but I want to move things along. But keep in mind, so a couple of things that most leadership images we have are male. And that is in large part because corporations were designed by, largely men and masculine figures and therefore masculine styles. And when you think about most of the strong leadership, the strong female images are often mother and mother related and maternal versus, so think about how those images are different and how they might play on it. Other things to keep in mind, I think for women, sometimes we think that our hard work and our excellence, that they'll be enough, but they're not. Because we have to show both strength and sensitivity, and we'll talk about why that is. And then, so it's funny because even within FMC and other companies, we hear about how, women are overly emotional and so, and on the political scape, you just see some of those things happening. And conversations about women's leadership are critical and they have to involve men. So the men that are here, thank you for being here. It's a super important part. And we call it, so Janet and I belong to an organization called the Boston Club, which is Executive Women. And we always talk about creating guys that get it. And that's a super important piece. So the more you can involve men in terms of the conversation, the better. So again, for my boys, we talk about this in terms of them being a part of a conversation. And so, and you also want to create support networks and mentoring for relationships that matters, right? So those are really important, and we'll talk about that when we get into some of the actual tips. And then some myths that are really interesting, and we hear this a lot. And Women aren't worth investing in because they leave for babies. And what was interesting is I was listening to a program this morning on NPR that talked about in September, 1.1 million people left the workforce in the United States. 860,000 of those were women. And part of that is because a lot of the different jobs that women have, and they're also trying to balance COVID. So there's lots of things, but that myth, and it was interesting. I was reading a couple of weeks ago, there's also another statistics that came out globally. 46% of people believe that women should not have the same opportunities within companies because they're just going to leave and have babies. So people really still believe that myth. Also, that you have to adopt a male leadership style in order to be successful. A lot of people sort of say, and this kind of also comes up in the United States around racial tensions. It's not an issue. We treat all people the same, like all lives matter or whatever it is. And if we don't honor the diversity that we bring, then we're missing out a lot. So, and in the next session, we're actually going to talk about unconscious bias. So we'll dive more into that. And then this is one of my favorites, that women want men to leave the table as if it's an either or a finite number. And we talk about the fact that we don't want you to leave the table. We just want you to move over and give us a seat, right? We want to be sitting next to you and not in the back. And that that strong women are too aggressive. And we see that politically right now all over. We saw it with Hillary. We see it all the time. This cartoon I found several months ago, the one in Mom is in a Meeting, and it sort of talks about that balance. And so this cartoon is one of my favorites of the COVID that has come out. So does anybody, if you have any other myths that you can think of, you can unmute and share with us or put them into the chat. Any myths that you find about men versus women leadership? Nope. Okay. So I saw this the other day as well, has to do with that different, and what's the difference between being assertive and being aggressive? And she says your gender. So I think we have to laugh about it, at some point. So, and then what's the problem, right? What are we looking at in terms of a problem? So how do women advance and achieve parity in environments that are based on masculine qualities? Again, because if we look at what's happening in most companies, they're based on male leadership models. And so how do you do that? And we'll actually, in the next session, we're also going to dive a little bit deeper into some of what's happening. So why do men and women lead differently? And again, feel free to put things into the chat as we go through this. Women actually, they have the higher oxytocin, so the cuddle hormone, and any biologists here will sort of know any of this. So that makes you feel connected to other people, and it leads to a stronger desire to connect. And so most women see leadership, therefore, as an opportunity to grow their staff, and they're better at verbally explaining emotions. And then men, emotionally vulnerable releases a stress hormone called cortisol. And so therefore they avoid addressing emotions. They naturally fear vulnerability, and we'll talk more about that. They focus on rewards and results, and they look at this problem solving and status updates as how they see things, rather than sort of through that verbally expressing emotions. So you can see in terms of why that is, it's a good foundation for conversation.
And as people are pointing out in the chat, it's the emotion is a double-edged sword. It gets held against us. We're seen as sometimes too emotional, whereas it's actually an asset, which we'll talk about.
Yep. So I thought this was interesting in terms of bringing it to modern day. And this is an article from Forbes that was in early September. And these are two women who are professors in different universities in the UK. And they did a study that, and this is the article is called Women Leaders' Competence on COVID, and it's called The Proof. And so, but these two women did this, and they had published a paper on leading the fight against the pandemic. And does gender really matter? And what was interesting, and just a couple of summations of it, and if people want that, reach out, or I can put it in the chat later. But COVID outcomes were better for female-led countries because they were quicker to lock down and they had fewer fatalities. And part of that is because women are more risk averse. But what's interesting is, even in the article, and this is where language matters, and the reason I wanted to open and talk about this, because one of the things they said in the article is that rather than, so it's labeled as women being risk averse, rather than saying something like men are risk seeking, right? So it's always towards the women. When you think about it, it's violence against women, right? Not men, by men. And so the object of violence against women is men, and that object is gone. So it's the same thing here, where things from a language perspective continue to be labeled just in the language that we use as a woman's problem. So women are more risk averse, rather than saying men are more risk seeking or risk, finding, whatever it is. And I think to keep that in mind when we're framing an issue and we're labeling a problem, about where it is that's how that label is coming. And so the second part of that is, so there were two elements to it. One is the aversion or gravitation towards risk, and then leadership style, where women lean more towards empathy, and empathy has gone up exponentially in the last 6 months since COVID. Women have much more democratic and participative leadership styles, and they had more clear and decisive communications. And those styles came through. So when you think about New Zealand or Germany, or some of the Nordic countries, why that had a profound impact. So I thought I would bring that in terms of a way of kind of opening up and looking at leadership and male-female leadership and conversations in the COVID crisis. So any comments or thoughts about this? Again, feel free to put it into the chat if you want. All right, so let's get into the whole gender ritual piece. So we're looking at gender rituals, men and women in conversation. I'm going to actually ask people to chat at this instead of doing a poll. So if you could put, how strongly do you feel conversation style differences by gender at FMC? So how strongly do you feel conversation style differences? So 1 is not at all, and 5 is very strongly. So if you could just put a number into the chat, that would be great. How strongly do you feel that those are happening? How strongly do you feel them happening around you? And men, feel free to chat as well.
We got a 1, a couple of 2s, lots of 2s. The scale is 1 is not at all, and 5 is strongly. Oh, 4. 3. 5.
That often varies by how many people who's in your group and who you're interacting with. And I know in the prep sessions we had some conversations where some people were the only female in the group.
And sometimes it's generational. If you've been in your work for a long time, you may have suffered more greatly. We would all like to think there's been some progress.
Yep. Okay, Janet will keep monitoring the chat, but let's get in. So there's a woman named Dr. Deborah Tannen. She is a sociolinguist at Georgetown University. She has been doing this work on studying men and women in conversations. And if you want to, I have a blog on our website about how men and women lead differently. And there's a clip from her. It's not a great video, but certainly interesting and enlightening. So she started doing this work in the 80s. And then published a book in You Just Don't Understand Men and Women in Conversation. And what's interesting is there's a guy named, his last name is Gray, and he wrote a book about men are from Mars, women are from Venus, or the other way around. Yeah. His work was based on her work, which just the irony of the fact that here she did all this great stuff. And then when you think about men and women in conversation, he's the one who gets the credit. So not lost on all of us. But anyway, so Deborah Tannen, great stuff. She also has a lot of stuff around argument cultures and the role of the media. She's just really brilliant. Tons of YouTube videos as well. But she talks about this idea of the role of talking in conversations and in the workplace, and that conversations are in essence the grease of the business engine. So when you think about in your daily work life, how much of your work, how much of your deliverables, the value you add is through a conversation, you can see how fundamental that becomes to the ways in which you can do your work and others can do your work. But people have different conversational styles. But the problem is that conversational styles is invisible. And so instead we say, well, I just always say what I mean. But that doesn't, and then we attribute any kind of miscommunications to, Janet has had bad intentions, or it's her character, or, or something that Ramya had done, or Kareen, or Barry, or whoever it is, and then to our relationships with those people. The thing about it, though, is talk at work is public, and our conversations are judged often unconsciously. And that's the really hard part. So what I want to do is I want to go through the masculine and feminine styles here. And as we're going through this, I'd like you to try to take some notes, because we're going to move into breakouts in a minute. And then when we do that, I want you to think about the ways in which this shows up for you. And again, when we go through it, we're talking about male approach versus female approach, but we're talking about a continuum. So in essence, men engage, they look in the world in terms of one-upmanship. So are you above me or below me? So they look at hierarchical social order, which is either one up or one down. That means, again, we're talking about conversation as the grease. That means conversation are negotiations in which people try to achieve and maintain an upper hand if they can, if they're up on top, or if somebody is above them, they want to protect themselves from people's attempt to push them down and push them around. That means that by nature, you see others as adversaries. And so your work life is a struggle to preserve independence and avoid failure. Again, remember, we talked about that biologically, where that comes from. And so status comes from being in the center stage and giving orders that people follow. So hierarchies are based on power and accomplishment, right? So that's the male approach. So when you think about that in terms of, again, men approach the world in terms of, are you above me or are you below me, right? So for people who have been in relationships with, men and women, and this is a classic one where the men and women are arguing, and then the guy says, can we just talk about it tomorrow? Wants to roll over and go to sleep. Here's why that comes up. So when we look at women approach the world, their communication approach is around intimacy and connection. So we are a network of connections. And so conversations, therefore, instead of being negotiations for status and hierarchy, right, in which people are trying to above and below, they are instead conversations for closeness, in which people try to seek and give confirmation and support and try to reach consensus. So women see each other as potential collaborators, whereas men, let's go back again, see each other as adversaries. Again, these are generalizations and these are the extremes, right? Women look at life as community, a struggle to preserve intimacy and avoid isolation. We are taught we want to protect others from their attempts to push us away, and therefore hierarchies are based on friendship. And so a couple of points in here, right? One is the biggest mistake is believing that there's kind of a right way to listen in the conversation, and so each person. So you want to think about it. For women, we are taught sameness. So think about the language, oh, she's uppity, or she's she's a snob, or whatever it is, because women are socialized to be the same. And we'll talk about that in terms of conversation in a little bit, but women are socialized to be the same and for sameness. And we are in a lot of ways unconsciously dinged or not, or seen negatively if we try to say something or make ourselves look better or feel better. So this is an interesting one in terms of the ways that gender differences show up. This is from a woman named Susan Adams, who is a professor, Wellesley, I think, but Jen and I know her. She has a book called Time for Solutions. And this is an interesting chart in terms of the way in which women do rapport talk and men do report talk, right? So the ways in which because that's about status and hierarchy. So if I give you a report, I'm telling you about how I'm above you or below me. And if I do rapport talk, then I'm talking about the ways in which we're the same in our relationships. Collaboration and competition, doing suggestions versus directive. Women internalize that versus men externalize it. Women talk about in terms of being connected, and men want to differentiate themselves. So women, again, we want to be connected and socialized, or a feminine style versus detached. Women want to label things in terms of how things are the same. So they talk about how things are in context of others, versus men are talking about something specific and isolated. Intuitive, factual, and then networks for relationships, and men are networking for connections. And what's interesting about that is we're going to talk about networking, but men tend to network inside of a company for positions. Women tend to network outside of the company. And so thinking about that in terms of creating networks, and women want to validate each other versus where men want to debate. So let me just stop and see, are there any questions or comments in the chat before we move into breakouts?
Not on this, Stephanie. We've got an avid reader of Deborah Tannen's books and a nice endorsement there, but no questions right now.
Excellent, thank you. All right, so we're going to put you into breakout groups. And in doing that, we're going to have you spend a few minutes, and I want you to think about, how do you see gender differences in conversations showing up in your work environments, right? How do you see gender differences in conversations showing up in your work environments? And so if you haven't used Zoom, this is why we put in the instructions that people needed to, that this was going to be interactive, because you're going to have to move yourself into the breakout rooms. And so you'll get a cue. When we say, you'll get a cue that says, and then you'll be invited to join, and then you join that. And once inside the room, we ask you to unmute and turn on your video, because you're only going to be a handful of people in there. At any point, you can click the button to return to the main room, and then we'll give you a 2-minute warning once that's done. But you can stay in the breakout room, because at 1 minute, you'll automatically be returned, and that will happen. So again, we go back to the question here. How do you see gender differences in conversations showing up in your work environments? So I'm going to create the breakouts, and we'll put 4 to 5 of you into a room. Actually, I'm going to do 3 to 4 instead. And again, when you get into that, you'll get a note that says, pop-up that says join, and click on that. And then when you get into the room, please unmute and put your video on, and then we'll go from there. So time is now. Enjoy, but feel free to pop back if you want to. All right, so how were those breakouts for people? Anybody have comments? So you want to put them into the chat?
This is Terly. I apologize. It was hard for me at the end. I was trying to participate, but it was hard for me to find out the mute button. So sorry for that. But yeah, it was a good conversation. Thank you.
Okay. Well, now you have it. So, but maybe you got to listen. So that's good. All right. Thank you for that. Okay, we did the breakouts. So now let's get into some of the concretes. Janet, feel free to interrupt or jump in here as we go through these. So let's begin with some of the behaviors of business and leadership and what that looks like. So let's talk about women in authority. Again, remember I mentioned girls learn early not to sound too sure of themselves. Why? Because we are socialized for sameness and connection, and we're not socialized for distance, distance and hierarchy. And so, women in authority, promotion and advancements are individual events, and they're not sort of for the group, that we see them as something that's separate from the group, whereas men see that as all tied together. And then we look at, we are often seen by ourselves and by others that differences are to the lack of capabilities rather than a differences in style. So if we think about the fact, again, most companies are built by men and the male leadership models, and therefore having different leadership styles, if we're not careful, we look at as less than rather than just a difference in style. And so the other aspect is that because women tend to use language that softens the blow of the bad news, again, because we're about connections, we often downplay our own capabilities. We are often judged not just by men, but by women and by ourselves as less capable. And so those are a couple of things to keep in mind as we go through some of the authority. So let's get into some of the tips, right? First is self-advocacy, right? So as we think about this, if you could take a minute and think about, what do you want, right? As both men and women, what do you want? Here are some examples. Put these into the chat, please. Do you want to be promoted, to make money, to be in the right meetings, to make and influence decisions, to be your authentic self? What do you want? Put some of that in for you as both men and women. What do you want in terms of your career, in terms of your role at FMC? What do you want? And
Yes.
Janet,
yeah, self-advocacy, it really begins with feeling, believing, being confident that you deserve, that you have a right to want progress, to want things to be as good as they can be for you, that you don't have to accept what is. So starting there is being clear about something that is important to you, that you could go for.
Mm-hmm.
Make a greater impact, influence decisions. There's a lot of those.
Mm-hmm.
Balance, yeah. Decision-making, being heard, opportunities, a lot of being heard, taken seriously. I mean, the clearer you are about what you want, the more likely you are to get it.
That's right. Absolutely true. And that's, what gets in the way, right? Women are not encouraged to self-advocate. We are encouraged instead to take care of others. So when we think about it was an interesting article, I guess it was about 1.5 years ago, that talked about when women volunteer within a company, they're volunteering to be on like a culture committee, or they're volunteering to plan the holiday party. They're not volunteering to be in the design of the new building. They're not volunteering to be part of the business enterprises. They're volunteering for some of the softer things. And that's an important piece too. The other aspect is we believe that working hard, that our hard work will be recognized. So we don't self-advocate because we think somebody will notice. And so we accept versus negotiate salary. And a classic example of this is you go in and you just accept an offer rather than coming back and just taking that. And then we have to balance speaking up with silence, right? And so how do we find our voices? So part of that foundation is know what you want. Again, as we said in the slide, and then Janet was talking about, visualize yourself in a leadership role, because if you can't imagine it, who can, right? So visualize yourself in that role. Understand yourself. If you haven't done a DISC or emotional intelligence or any of these tools that help you, what are your strengths and weaknesses, and how is it going to help get you there? And then build your brand. So one that is authentically you. Be who you are and have that foundation. But to do that, that means you have to have confidence and competence, right? And you have to show it. So confidence is actually, it's an internal feeling, right? And so it has to do in terms of, often how we see ourselves, and then also how we're judged, right? So we judge that, and it's circumstantial. So when we see somebody, we see confidence often as somebody who is, what does it look like? They have strong facial expressions, they have body language, see my hands are moving, all of the aspects, right? And digitally, we also have something that's called electronic body language. So there are, strong, decisive, confident in facial expressions, but that's all circumstantial. And sometimes those signs of confidence and competence are counterintuitive to the ways in which we are taught, and women are taught to socialize and to be in conversation. And so that's an important piece of it. So I want to do a poll now. And so I'd ask you to each do this. I'm going to launch the poll. But the question is, how confident are you in your negotiating skills? I'm going to launch the poll and ask each of you to respond to this. So there should be a pop-up that comes on your screen. How confident are you in your negotiating skills? And so let's do that. So we have 11, 12. Let's get a few more before we end it. So 15. See if we can get a few more. Okay, we have a few more. Okay, anybody else find it? 3, 2, 1. Okay, so let's share the results. So so here we are. So we have a couple not at all, but lots of people are right in the 3 range. 1 very confident. I love it. 4s, so pretty good, right? So interesting there. Okay, so that's where we are in terms of negotiating skills. So let's look at what that looks like, right? What's interesting is then, so I want to talk about this idea of inside out versus outside in, and then I would love to see if you could either chat or unmute and talk for a minute or two about this idea. So research shows that one of the women are reasons lagging in salary, a tiny reason, just a tiny reason to be clear, is our failure to negotiate. And there are 2 different ways to do that. One is an inside out, starts with an idea. And so it starts inside and works its way out. So I state my need, my opinion or idea. So I say to Janet, I think that we should both get offices together, right? And then on this thing, she would say, okay, if she has another idea, she'd say, okay, yeah, but I want the office to be close to my house. And then I say, no, I want it to be close to my house. And then we negotiate, right? That's inside out. An outside in starts from the outside and starts in terms of a vague statement like, Janet, I was thinking maybe we should get a shared office somewhere. What do you think about that? Or, what would you like to do there? And then in that, it invites others to share their perspectives, and therefore the conversation is the negotiation, as opposed to in the inside out, you're actually negotiating because it's really a much more explicit and intentional way of negotiating. So here's what I'd ask you to do. If you could unmute and maybe talk a little bit about which do you see as masculine. So again, in terms of inside out is a more masculine way of negotiating, and the outside in is a more feminine way of negotiating. And so how do you see this impacting you? What are your thoughts in terms of how you negotiate and how it impacts you in salary and in work breakdowns and in work products? You could either chat or unmute and just speak up a little bit.
Can you think of examples where you wish you had approached something differently?
The one thing that I've seen is that usually when you from the very beginning, right, recruiters, the way the hiring process goes, you at the very beginning, either you have been given a range of salaries that you want to work with, or they ask you what do you expect. Mm-hmm. So this is what confuses me. I mean, I can most of the times in the very first step, it's easier for me to just say, okay, I'll just go for market rates and stuff. But then how do you answer that question, and how to be sure that you are decisive, but and that you're open to negotiation, and not look fake, is something that I've always struggled with. So yeah, I don't want to be seen as somebody who's trying to get away with that question till you are there to be passing all the technical rounds and everything, and be able to negotiate salary. But I feel that when you know more about the company, when you are interviewing with them, it gives you a better founding and more information about what you would like to do with it. So the question of the salary thingy in the very beginning kind of just does throw me off.
It does or does not. It does, you said.
It does,
Yeah,
yes.
yeah. Yep, because we're not taught to self-advocate, right? And we're taught to sort of soften things because we're socialized for sameness, rather than being able to do that. And so what you're saying, I think it's Lavanya, right? You're saying that you want to wait until you have more evidence of how you'll fit and how your self-worth and how your skills will fit in before you do that.
That's
Um,
correct.
Yes. And so, but if you think about that is kind of the self-advocacy piece versus a more masculine style would say, well, I already know I'm going to add value. It was interesting because when I studied this many years ago, my brother-in-law he's in California, works in the theater industry in movies. And I got to participate and be a part of a study that I was actually a lead in the study that looked at men and women in game shows. And what happens is that men do exponentially better in game shows because before the person even is done speaking, the host, they've already hit the buzzer, even if they have no idea what the answer is. Whereas women want to hear the entire thing and think about it and then have the answer. And
Correct.
so they talked about how much more men make a lot more in game shows because they are faster to hit that button, which I found completely interesting and really related to what you're saying here, Lavanya, around how much do I have to know in order to make that, because it's going to be that logical conversation.
Right.
Does that have as much to do with the extrovert introvert difference? Because introverts generally like to think about something before they respond. Extroverts can kind of think afterwards or think out loud. So more than the gender difference, it's about that personality, the introvert versus extrovert.
I think it's in combination, Virginia. I think that's a really good point in terms of, so if you're an introvert and an introverted female, then it makes it even more interesting around that. But I think it's a great point in that. So any other comments? Padma, do you have your hand up on purpose?
Yes.
Oh, Karine.
That's correct. So I kind of agree with Lavanya's viewpoint. So I have seen, I have observed myself negotiating for salary related and promotions, and I've seen the way my husband approaches. So I've seen that he's more assertive and he's confident about his skill sets. I say, I know this, I'm better than this. And although he doesn't have those skill sets, yet he's confident and he says that I deserve this. But in my case, I start thinking whether I really deserve this or not.
That's right.
So,
and next time we're going to talk, in the next session, we're going to talk about some of these differences, but I'll give you a little spoiler alert. And that men will say, if there's a job description, at 50% of the qualifications, they'll apply for it. Women are closer to the upper 80s or early 90% of qualifications before they'll even think about applying for a job. So how does that then impact your ability to negotiate salary? Karine, let's take your question and then let's move on.
Oh, I used to use the outside in, and I have to say it's not as successful as the inside out. I think that's more likely to succeed for me. And for me, I use this and I tell myself, what's the worst thing? I get a no, but I really, that's the worst case. It's not like you're going to get fired for asking for promotion. So that really helps me getting unstuck.
And that confidence piece, right, comes in again. So super interesting.
I think it actually makes life easier for other people because they know what you're talking about more quickly. They actually respond well to that clarity rather than kind of going around and around.
So can I ask a quick question? So in my experience, I've also noticed that in interviewing men, they are less challenging to how do you know you fit in, what makes you a team player, than when you're a woman and you're being interviewed. It seems like we have to perform a lot differently in the interview than a man does. So you find that is true?
So women are hired. So men are hired based on the potential that they can bring. Women are hired based on their track record of what they've brought. It has to do with hiring and negotiation. So that's, again, unconsciously, because it's about, we have to prove ourselves again and again. And I was just talking to someone this morning saying, it's very true. We have to do it backwards and in heels. So I'm going to move on so that we have enough time. the next aspect here is networking. And this is where the relationships, and you lean on people. So, so how many of you, and feel free, please put this into the chat, right? How many people practice networking, are doing regular intentional networking? How many of you are LinkedIn, right? Feel free to link in with me and Janet, please. How many of you are on LinkedIn and regularly network inside and outside of your everyday work world? How do you do that, and what have you gained? So if we can put that into the chat. In terms of networking, are you on LinkedIn? Are you networking inside the company, outside the company, attending industry things? So thinking about how are you networking? How are you creating your base? And women, are we networking just with other women, or are we also networking with men? What are we doing around that? Love to have that, and that chat will also be saved. Mm-hmm. So for Padma and Nisha and Ramya, I'll send that to you. I'd love to hear in terms of your networking.
Some LinkedIn, both inside, both outside, definitely not just with other women, networking, professional organizations as well.
Right. And inside the company.
Almost purposely avoid networking, yikes.
Yeah.
I know, I feel like never enough, but yeah.
So what I think for each of you to think about is, again, when we went earlier and Janet was talking about what is it you want? If as a female leader, if you can't envision it, then nobody can. So what are my goals? What do I want to accomplish? And then what do I need to be successful? Who do I know that can help me? How do I get access to them? What's my ask? What will when will I do this? So really, particularly as scientists and engineers, take a logical approach to your networking in the same way you would anything else, and make sure so that people know about your capabilities so you can do that, right?
Make a plan.
Make a plan, right? So again, we just talked about this in terms of self-advocacy, so the gender myths and the differences in the rituals. And then we talked about self-advocacy, negotiating, and networking. Couple of points before we finish up. Let's talk about interactions for a few minutes in a couple of keys. And this is my favorite. And this is, I'm sorry. It's apologies and gender. Women tend to say I'm sorry more frequently, unless they're Canadian, which Barry, if you're still on the line, you know that I was going to say that. But they aren't necessarily taking blame. What they mean is I'm sorry that happened, or I'm sorry things are this way. They are not saying I'm responsible or it's my fault. As I go over this, think back to men socialized for status and hierarchy, women socialized for connection. Why would I'm sorry be like that? Why would women say I'm sorry that happened versus men when they say sorry less frequently, but they are taking responsibility for something having gone wrong? Any thoughts, and put those into the chat, please. Thoughts about why that might happen, right? So why I'm sorry is I'm sorry that happened, as opposed to I'm sorry I'm responsible. And how does that relate to gender and those gender conversations? And what does it mean in terms of self-deprecating and conditional language? So does that make sense? I'm just checking in. Maybe it's just me, but I'm no expert in this. So we want, again, this is the language that we open up with to do for sameness, as opposed to one up and one down. So we have to do that self-deprecating language so we're not seen as uppity or better than. And women, think about in high school, right? At least in the US and some places, women who were thought of themselves as better were ostracized by high school girl cliques, right? There's lots of studies on that. And then
really check yourself on some of that language. Everyone, you'll be surprised how often it might show up in your emails or in your exchanges.
And hold each other accountable as well. So, and then the last piece of this in terms of interactions is interrupting is often perceived as a way of dominating, right? So it can be a way of exerting status and establishing connections. So if I can interrupt somebody, then I'm taking control and I'm above them or below them, right? So again, interruptions are a way of doing that. And if anybody hasn't seen an exponential rise in how women are interrupted in Zoom and video meetings or Teams meetings, you're not paying attention. And all of the research talks about how much easier it is for people to interrupt each other in video conferences than in in-person ones. And so, but the thing about it is women, we don't necessarily interrupt each other for power or dominance. We are interrupting each other for something called rapport talk, and that's parallel talk, right? So we are interrupting each other because we want to have sameness. So Janet could be talking about how she had a great weekend and she was really excited because she found this really great living room furniture on sale. And as she's talking, I might say, oh, that's awesome. I found a coffee table this weekend too. And we're talking almost at the same time, but I'm not interrupting her. I'm doing parallel speak, which is, again, it's about sameness. I'm saying, yes, I have that same experience. I also got some furniture for my living room, or I also found that I saw the data in this way. And so we're doing that for rapport. It's called parallel speak. So watch how men and women interact each other differently and then what that looks like. So anyway, keep that in mind. So that's there. So what I'm going to ask you to do, and I know some people have to go, but I would love to do another round of breakouts if possible. And then have you think about, okay, how can you apply one or more of these concepts? And then we'll come back and so I'll just for 2 or 3 minutes, I'll do small groups and then have you come back and then we will have questions and do feedback. So, so let me go to the breakouts and we'll do those really quickly, just for a few minutes. I'll make them smaller. And so we'll be 2 to 3 people in each. And then, so we'll do a few minutes and then come on back out and then we'll have questions, but also Corrine can find me, any of the planning team can find us if you have questions as well. And I know some of you might need to jump. So let's jump into the rooms then. So comments about, so again, let me just use this. Okay. All right, so we had one action. If you guys, anybody willing to put it into the chat, that would be great. And so we have some resources on the website. We send out, we have blogs and we send out tips about distance working if anybody's interested. The website is www.bridgingdistance.com. We actually just published a blog on proximity bias, which is huge in remote work. And then we'll be doing this again, I know, but let's just see what questions there are, questions, random thoughts that people have. And then I think Ramya is going to close us out. But so what questions do you have? What comments, random thoughts do people have for us?
I think this is a very good presentation, just opening up my thoughts about how differently both gender thinks. And I do think that there are a lot of things that I intentionally do, but in the same token, I think that it's driven by the person's personality too.
Mm-hmm. Of course, so, all of these are factors. Yep.
Because I noticed that if I could be very competitive when I'm 100% confident, but then that would be toward more probably my talk, my actions be more leading towards kind of similar to how a male would be. But then once I am getting like just slightly unconfident, then I would kind of like switch back totally to like, okay, is it okay? Should I check in with people or stuff like that? So it's totally kind of like that, you know, the introvert extrovert thing, you know, it's very totally opposite. It really depends on my confidence level.
Yep. Okay. Corrine, you had your hand up.
Yes, I wanted to give a shout out to Sophia because you asked the questions as to what is this that you want, whether it was more money, or promotion, or have a bigger impact. And she said all of it. And I'm like, that's it.
That worked, girl,
Don't
Sophia.
pick one. Go for all of it.
All of the above.
Shout out
Awesome.
Sophia for that.
Go, Sophia.
Thank you. Yeah, I was about to make the comment. It was really funny to see that nobody talked about those monetary reward. Yeah, just my feedback. Thank you.
How about others? Comments or thoughts?
Stephanie, a quick question. Are the slides going to be available?
Yeah, I can send those out. You'll also see them on the recording. So yeah,
Great.
we'll do that.
Any examples, guys, of one thing that you want to do, one action you want to take? Like next week, I'm going to start doing this or stop doing that, or...
Well, I have a comment to make about that. I was going to type it in, but I may as well just say it. So in my breakout group, we talked a little bit about, what do we use, when we're in dialogue or discussion or some kind of debate, and so what kind of tools? And I think because we're so kind of hardwired, to certain mannerisms, behaviors as women, I think if there's, a couple of little tools in your toolbox or arrows in your quiver that can kind of help that. So for instance, being empathetic to someone's feelings, or validating someone's opinion by saying, yeah, that's a really good suggestion. And I would suggest this, not using the negative, but using the positive word and, and even body language, sitting a certain way or standing a certain way in front of a male audience, how to handle being talked over, how to make sure that your message has been heard. Just, more or less tools, not so much changing all of my behavior all at once, but
Yep. No, I love that. Well, and I think, I think Janet's point was a good one around the language we use. So how do we help each other and give each other feedback around, can you have something that's a little more decisive in the language? To your point, Joan, when you're standing up in front of people, are you using some of that non-confident and self-deprecating language? Yep. Yeah. How about others?
I wanted to say one thing, and it's from the Deborah Tannen book. It's actually from the first book, which is more about relationships and conversations between men and women. But it's the one thing that made me think about how the language is so different. And that was a story that she tells of two people, a man and a woman, driving in a car. And the woman says, wouldn't you like to stop by blah, blah, blah and do this? And the man says no and keeps driving. Well, she wasn't saying, would you like to? She was saying, I would like to. But she didn't say it that way.
Yeah.
And so he didn't want to, so he didn't. And that one illustration just changed a lot. It changed certainly the way I speak in my personal relationships with men. It made me remember, you don't put it as a question and then be unhappy with the answer. You say what it is you want.
That's right. That's right.
And make it clear. Now, you may still have a disagreement about what the two of you want, but now it's not being couched in the terms of, would you like to do this? No.
Right. And that's the inside out versus outside in negotiation, Janet, right?
Exactly.
That's that exact, and it's a really good example of that, because, you might not think about that as negotiation, but it was, because you got to negotiate to stop the car. So that's the outside in versus the inside out. I love that.
I want to chime in on what Joan was saying, the tool part of it. I am like a person that it's avoiding any kind of confrontation, but a lot of times when discussion gets heated, it gets to like more confrontation, or I don't know how to kind of describe it in that term. So I am thinking like, and then it becomes to negotiation between how to reach to a point that everyone's needs in for the topic to address something. So, like, is there any tool or any kind of techniques that we could do or work on our negotiation skills? I think that would be something that would be very meaningful or I don't know, beneficial.
I think something else that Stephanie touched on earlier is about knowing yourself is seeking out some kind of assessment, like a DISC assessment, so that you are really clear about what your natural style is and how to be effective with people who are not like you, how to be effective with people who are more kind of assertive, you know, aggressive, or if you are, that I have found to be extremely helpful, so that you get the result that you're looking for by meeting people, understanding the example that Janet gave, you know, like, he's a different person. He has a different way of communicating than she does. If you know that, then you will approach him differently. If for anyone who is in the spirit of books, the Deborah Tannen books are fantastic. If you are an introvert, this book's by Susan Cain. Oh, you can't see it because I have a background. Susan Cain has written a book called Quiet: The Power of Introverts in a World That Can't Stop Talking. And it is phenomenal. If you think you are an introvert, it helps you understand and have confidence about your value, and it gives you, because I'm kind of this way, so it kind of gives you confidence to stand up for yourself. I'll pop it in the it's really very good.
Okay. What other questions do people have? I don't know, any of the men that are still left, any questions or comments about this? Was it, hopefully you didn't feel like it was male bashing in any way, but we're trying to, you know, do things, you know.
It was a great session, Stephanie and Janet. Thank you so much. You know, I'm sure we all enjoyed, we learned a lot, and I wish, you know, we had more time on the breakout session and for the presentation. Unfortunately, we don't have much time.
I know.
But that being said, you know, this is our first Lunch and Learn. There's going to be three more topics, but again, different topics. But the next one is going to be scheduled for November 17th. The topic is going to be how to advance professional and personally without having to choose between work and home. Again, you know, we will be sending out this invitation to all folks across different work sites, and we will meet you all again.
Yeah, so. And there's again a blog on the site, and I just put into the chat, if you haven't seen a YouTube video by a guy named Mark Unger called The Nothing Box, it is hysterical. I just put it into the chat. It is very funny, so enjoy that. It just makes fun of all of what we've talked about in a very humorous way. So it's good for date night. Awesome. Thanks everybody. Thanks for your attention, and we'll see you in a few weeks. Have a great weekend.
Thank you.
And I'll see you in a few minutes.
Thank you, Stephanie. Thank you, Ramya. Bye.
Thank you.